It's almost like people want to be sad, but they can't because it's so beautiful. And now that it's beautiful, it's also something worth protecting.
I'm Heather Grish, and this is the Wisdom of the Body podcast. This podcast explores the idea of body intelligence as the real key to learning the knowledge of life, or what we call Ayurveda in the ancient language of Sanskrit. We do that by connecting with today's creative leaders and experts who will help you listen to your body, trust your gut, and live in deeper harmony with nature. Come join me as we unlock the golden door to clear, direct perception and become very deep listeners. You can find the Wisdom of the Body podcast on Apple, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can also follow us by joining my email at heathergrish.com or on Instagram at heathergrish. I know you're going to love this podcast, so take a second right now to subscribe. I can't tell you how many things I've done in my life because I thought I was supposed to do them, or because I was grasping for an answer, conclusion, or solution to something. I really wasn't sure what I was going to find out when I interviewed my guest in today's episode. It was a total whim. I knew he was an artist and an activist for climate change, and I'm always connecting the health of our bodies to the health of the planet. You could also say that I'm a little bit obsessed with creative processes, whether somebody is creating people, new habits, products, or art. So today you get to learn some tips from the creative process of one super impactful artist. And after the interview, stick around because I'll let you know what I learned so we can compare notes. Today I'm here with Benjamin Von Wong, who is an artist focused on amplifying positive impact. Von Wong's work lies at the intersection of fantasy and photography and combines everyday objects with shocking statistics. It has attracted the attention of corporations like Starbucks, Dell, Nike, and has generated over 100 million views for causes like ocean plastics, electronic waste, and fashion pollution. Most recently, he was named one of Adweek's 11 content-branded masterminds. He's also the host of the Impact Everywhere podcast, and I'm so excited to have him here today to talk about his work and how it's impacting the planet. So thank you so much for joining us, Benjamin.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah. We recently met in an audio chat room on Clubhouse, which I'm addicted to. I don't know if you are too, but it's been a new recent addiction of mine. And I think the room was maybe on the topic of photography. I'm not a photographer, but I love art and I love artists. And I don't really know what it was about your voice or your words, but the moment I heard your voice, I said, I need to talk with this guy. So I'm here interviewing you here today, and we're going to find out why we needed to talk.
Amazing. I love that. Thanks for reaching out.
Yeah. So I've checked out your work. It's so amazing. And you have this great story about going from making a huge career switch at some point in your life and also becoming kind of an activist with your art. How did you go from being a hard rock mining engineer to becoming a photographer or an artist?
Yeah, life is very nonlinear sometimes. And in my case, maybe a little bit more opposite than most. But I started off as a hard rock mining engineer, not because I necessarily had a passion for it, but because I went to university young. I was good at math and physics. And my dad was an engineer. So went to the open house. And as you know, the best sales pitch wins, the best story, the best narrative. And the mining folks said, you get to travel the world, you get paid more. They're the smallest classrooms. I was like, oh, wow, all that sounds great. So I just enrolled in it. And, before I knew it, I was 4-year program was about to end. And I was like, oh, crap, what happens now? I need to get a job in something I don't really care about. Anyways, I didn't have anything planned that was better to do with my life. And so although I wanted to take a gap year or go back to school, my parents were like, just go work. And so that's exactly what I did. I just went, got a job. And on evenings and weekends, I was doing photography. So I picked up photography after a girl broke up with me. And I was in the desert in Winnemucca, Nevada, which is actually an hour away from Black Rock City, just to tell you how far in the middle of nowhere it was. And I had no friends. I was under 21. And I was like, oh man, I really need something to do to keep myself busy. So bought a camera, and the camera sort of became not only a companion. I could bring it anywhere. It would give me something to do, but it could also be an access pass. I could go backstage to places. I could meet new people. I had an excuse to talk to people. And it was sort of this tool that made a ton of sense for a young adult trying to navigate the world. And On evenings and weekends, I just started shooting a lot. I got better and better at it. I built a following, and 3 years passed by. And one day I woke up and I was like, you know what? I don't want to be an engineer anymore. Well, I've always known that I didn't want to be an engineer, but I think I had the realization that if I didn't figure out what I wanted to do with my life now, then 10 years from now, I would be stuck in the same job on the desk with slightly higher paycheck doing the exact same thing. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. So I quit my job, not because I wanted to be an artist, but rather because I didn't want to be an engineer. So I was running away from something. And I wanted to travel. So it turns out that as a photographer, I could travel for free by offering to teach courses. And so I would reach out to a photo club, offer to teach a workshop. They would fly me there. I'd make a bunch of friends, and then I would have sofas to sleep on. And so I just loitered around, and then I'd wait for the next thing to speak at and fly there, and so on and so forth. And so I was basically nomadic for a number of years and building my career as an artist until eventually by 2015, I had landed like a global campaign for Huawei. I earned more money in that one job than my entire career combined. And I did a couple more campaigns, and, just felt like it all felt very pointless. Like the top of the mountain was not what I thought it would be. I was getting paid to do what I loved. I was getting some wonderful opportunities. I was traveling. I was doing cool stuff, but it felt very redundant. The why was missing. And that's when I started just kind of soul searching and trying to figure out what to do with myself. And the project that I felt most proud of at that time was actually not any photography project that I had done, but rather a fundraising video I had made for a family whose little girl was diagnosed with a terminal degenerative brain disease called Sanfilippo syndrome. And I had flown to their house, slept on their sofa for 10 days, and helped to create a video called Saving Liza that ended up raising $1 million over the course of a month and $2 million over the course of the year. And I was like, you know what? This is what creativity should be used for. It should be used for making a difference. This is the power of storytelling. And so I almost quit photography and hopped into documentary filmmaking, but sort of got bored because it just gets sad to tell sad stories all the time. And so there was just this sort of, I guess, challenge to figure out how do you combine fantasy and impact together. And it was through a year and a half of experimenting, trying different things. And as I was looking for meaningful projects to get involved in, I started watching more documentaries. I started learning more about things. And I sort of fell into the environmental movement completely by mistake. It's like once you start seeing things, you can't really unsee them. And I just started doing one project after the other. One of the hit projects that I did that sort of, I guess, defined my career was when I put a mermaid on 10,000 plastic bottles, documented that, made a video. It got 37 million views, and I think gave people the vision of what art and how art could be used in sustainability, and gave me a little bit of perspective too, and how it was really like a powerful tool. And since then, it's just been one project after another until COVID, which led me to the podcast. So anyways, that's my life story in, I don't know, 5-10 minutes, however long I was talking for.
I'm sure there's more to it. And it's funny, you realize younger than me that you were doing some work that you weren't really connected to with your soul. I similarly kind of had a quote unquote job for many years. I was in that for like 13 years before I really felt like I did the deep work to figure out what my purpose was. But you did. It sounds like you recognized that earlier than I did. And, one of the things that I just heard you say, which really intrigued me, was that related to your work that you've been doing with the environmental work and the art that you've been doing in that space to draw attention to the climate and the environment. You said once you start seeing things, you can't unsee them. What were you seeing that was really making an impact on you?
Right. So I think there's a difference between looking and seeing, or maybe it's between seeing and looking. So it's basically, you can go to work every single day and pass by these places and never actually see properly what's actually in front of you because it's just sort of passing you by. And I think that's kind of how most people navigate most issues in the world. And it makes sense because the world is complex. And so we kind of need to automatically just make assumptions and move on with the things that are less important. We prioritize. And in my case, when I started prioritizing, like watching documentaries and trying to understand a problem and understand the mechanics of it and what were the sources of it, well, then, after you dive into a couple documentaries and you start reading a little bit more, you're just like, oh, I used to kind of know, but now I actually know. And now I have all these facts and figures. And if I do nothing, then I become a hypocrite or I become a bad person. I guess I sort of challenged myself morally on certain things that you kind of take for granted. And, there's so many issues in the world. It really doesn't matter which one you pick. I think as long as you find something that calls you and to start diving a little bit deeper into it. And then that becomes, I guess, the entry point, the rabbit hole in which you can sort of stumble into. Because once you start that journey, you slowly realize increasingly that everything is connected. So I might be an environmentalist, but I actually don't think we can solve the environmental problem until we can't solve it without poverty and social issues, and we can't solve it without women and so on and so forth. So these issues are all interconnected. But if you never think beyond you and what you want and what your survival is and the I think in the equation, then it's a little bit harder to get sucked in. So yeah, that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. One of the reasons I wanted to talk with you is because I'm curious because I work with bodies and I work with emotions and bodies. And we talked earlier and you said you didn't know that much about Ayurveda, but it's sort of like, it's one of the forms of medicine that helps people understand their emotions because it actually gives people words for things that they feel in their bodies, but they don't have words for in their own language. And that idea of awareness of how we're treating our bodies in relation to, and I'm curious, it's something I contemplate a lot. Is there a relationship between how we treat our bodies and how we treat the planet as humans? And I'm haunted by this memory that I have when I was in India in 2015 before I had my kid. I went to India because I was in the journey of wanting to become a mother. And so I really went there to do a deep soul searching, and I was going to all these temples, and the questions I was like looking for the divine feminine, I was looking for the divine mother, and I was looking for her within me, but I was also looking for her all around me. And one of the things that I did when I was on this trip was I hiked at the base of a mountain at 6 o'clock in the morning. It was like sunrise around the base of this mountain with this female swami. And she was barefoot. She was amazing. She was in her 80s. We were hiking around this mountain, and it was just about getting light out. And this woman, we pass a house in a little town, and this woman walks out of her house with a bag of garbage. And it was a totally full bag of garbage with a plastic bag. And she takes the bag and she walks across the street from her house and she just throws it in the woods. Just threw this full bag of garbage in the woods. And I was so mortified that this happened. And yet I recalled times in my youth when I was younger, before I was like really connected to myself, my inner self and my outer self, the planet, where I would litter on the ground and I would throw things, and that sort of lack of reverence for life that was happening. And I realized that when I saw this, I said, maybe this isn't a weird thing for humans to want to get rid of things, but it's that we created this material that doesn't break down. That is really what the issue is. Because if I have an apple, I can just throw an apple. That, we were doing that 10,000 years ago, probably just throwing an apple wherever we wanted. But now we've gotten so smart that we could create these things that are not as easily broken down by nature. So this question of like our relationship with how we treat the planet, it really comes up for me because fertility is declining for women. You mentioned women. Fertility is declining for women, and fertility is declining on the planet, and the health of the planet is declining as well. I'm curious about, what do you think? Do you think those two are connected?
Yes. So we are obviously connected to the world through what we eat, at the very least, to what we consume, what we breathe, what we're surrounded by. And the fact that, if 92% of US tap water contains traces of microfibers, which comes from the clothing that we wear, that is now being ingested into our body, and every single piece of seafood that you might eat today will contain traces of plastic because it's what people are eating. Obviously, that's going to have some repercussion on us as human beings, just like the air that we breathe will impact how we feel. There's so much to be said about, I think, diet, and you can sense when you're eating junk in, your energy levels are low, right? So I think at its most basic level is definitely there. I think what was going on through my mind as you were talking about how your body is connected to the work that you're creating, I was picturing myself doing my projects and picturing like when I'm happiest. And it's so funny to me because when I'm happiest is usually when I'm beating up my body. Like I'm working on these projects that I'm really passionate by and I'm not sleeping. And my mind, my heart, my soul, my time, my mind, like I can't even rest because I'm just so focused on this thing that I'm trying to bring into existence, like literally will into existence. And I'm like, maybe there's some balance out there that I haven't attained yet. I have not ascended to that level quite yet where my mind and body and planet are all attuned in that way.
That's funny. One of my friends who was actually my roommate when I first moved to San Francisco, I interviewed him on an episode. You're actually the second artist I think I've had on my podcast. The first one was my friend Justin, who's a wildlife photojournalist and a documentary photographer. And he photographs, the white rhino and endangered animals. And that's his form of activism that he does through that work. But he tells this great story about how he got really injured doing his work and how he slipped on a shoot one day and like hurt his back. But he also had this really amazing story after going through that, how he used yoga to rehab his body and then was talking about how he climbed Mount Kilimanjaro after. So yeah, we certainly do beat ourselves up sometimes when we're doing work that we love. And that's like the seduction of our passion, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's because my personality type, I'm actually quite a lazy person, I think. And so when I pursue something I'm passionate about, then I work really, really hard for it. And I love that feeling of almost being addicted to a project. And it's something that almost takes over your mind. So at night, you can't sleep about it because you have so many ideas and that just makes you feel really alive. So I don't know. As I describe it to you, I'm like, this can't be a good thing. There's got to be a better way.
It's really interesting because it reminds me of being in love, when you're in love and you first meet someone, right? Just that sort of energy that charges through your body. And it's like you could pick up a car,
Exactly.
Love makes you do crazy things. So maybe what it is that when you become in love with your work, it makes you do crazy things.
Yes, yes. I definitely think I'm addicted to the passion behind the work for sure.
I want to talk about your work because it's really amazing. And I especially love one of your pieces. And I know you've done some commercial stuff and you've done some installations as well. But one of the ones I really like is the mermaid one that you did.
Yeah. What do you want to know about it?
Tell me about that project, because in some way I'm sort of seeing your engineering mind being put to good use in your art. To build what you build is quite complex. Tell us about the mermaid, because I know we're on an audio podcast, right? So we can't see your mermaid, but we need to share the picture of it later.
Yeah, for sure.
Tell us the story behind that and your process of building it.
Okay, so to describe it for the listeners, the mermaid on 10,000 plastic bottles sort of illustrates a number of images. There are 4 images in total of a mermaid interacting with plastic bottles that actually look like the sea. So you have one mermaid that looks like she's beached on a surface that is made out of plastic bottles. There's another one that looks like she's drowning, another one where she's being sucked down a drain. And then there's one more where she's inside of the shape of a teardrop. And so it's interesting to me that an image of a fantasy creature that doesn't exist is actually what made people understand the relationship between ocean and human in a way that hadn't actually been done before. And I think the strategy behind the work that I do is to evoke a sense of curiosity. So I really like it when people look at my work and they're like, wait, what am I looking at? Is this real? Is this fake? Because once you're able to ignite a sense of curiosity, then you're able to have a conversation. And suddenly you're not telling people, they want to know. So they're listening to you. And then you get the chance to talk about what you did, how you did it, but most importantly, why you did it. And so it enables, I think, just open communication. It has a potential to unlock feeling. And behind every story is another story. And so I think my work, I always try to have those 2 stories. There's a story of the photograph. What is the photograph? What is the art trying to say? And then there's the story of how it happened. And those are 2 very different things. So the story of how something happens, I think, is also a little bit scripted in that I try really hard to make the process as relatable as possible. So yes, most people won't have access to 10,000 plastic bottles. Yes, they won't have mermaid, but they can relate perhaps to what it might be like to clean and delabel like thousands and thousands of plastic bottles day after day and sorting them and organizing them by color, right? And so you kind of focus on these different elements in order to craft a narrative. And I think that's why the video at the end of the day had such reach. So how did it happen? I don't know. I guess I can go into a lot of detail, but the longer story, because you can watch the video online, but the longer story is I was in Montreal because my sister was getting married and I had planned 3 weeks to come back home and celebrate her wedding. And while I was there, my mom discovered this mermaid tail designer and she said like, hey, look at this person. She lives in Montreal. You might like it. And I checked it out. I was like, oh, wow, that mermaid tail is super cool. I wish I could do something. But because I had decided to only do things that were focused on impact, I had to ask myself, well, what story could I tell that involved a mermaid and something meaningful? And I think this was at the time right around when the Great Pacific Garbage Patch was getting a lot of attention. I kind of thought about it a while and I was like, you know what? I think if a mermaid was like drowning in an ocean of plastic, it could be pretty interesting. And that just cascaded sort of, one thing leads to another. So the project, I think, when you look at it in its final form, looks really complex, but then you just break it down into lots of little pieces. So I need lots of plastic bottles. Where do I find it? Well, I could find it in a recycling center, perhaps. And so one of my friends actually called a number of different recycling centers to see if they would be okay to give us plastic bottles. And at that time, I think I didn't really expect someone to say yes. But my friend called me back 3 days later and said, hey, we got a group called Tomra, and they said yes. They said, we're happy to give you 10,000 plastic bottles. We'll ship it to you in an 18-foot truck. When do you want it and where do you want to put it? And I was like, oh, crap. I hadn't thought that far. Like, what do you mean 18-foot truck? I had like no concept of how much 10,000 plastic bottles were. I just asked for it because it sounded like a good number. And so I ended up like needing to figure out where to go. And then there was a friend whose wedding I had shot 5 years back who I thought was fairly wealthy. So I reached out to him and he had a flooring company. So he lent us his warehouse for free. And then I started looking for volunteers to help us like clean all these plastic bottles. And then I reached out to the mermaid tail designer and I said I had a warehouse and I had these plastic bottles. Would she like to collaborate? And then we had to find a model and then we had to find a hairstylist. So like I think one thing just leads to another. And it's this idea of momentum that you can truly build up. I think the easiest or the best thing to do is to start with the hardest parts first, because if you get those, then people want to get involved, right? Like once I had mermaid tail, plastic bottles, and warehouse, it was really easy to get volunteers because when's the next time you get to play with 10,000 plastic bottles to create some meaningful project? And it's such an unexpected situation. And I think people want to be a part of something bigger than themselves. People want to have a unique experience. And so that's kind of how the project took place. But you can type Von Wong mermaid on Google and you can find the video.
If you want to create a more receptive body, free from toxins, inflammation, and metabolic issues, would it be crazy for you to explore booking an Ayurvedic consultation with me? There's probably never been a more perfect time to do it. Every day you wait matters when it comes to your health. So if you're ready to get your body back in balance, I'll give you a 30-day plan to get you started. Go to heathergrish.com to book a consultation. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. So you talked about, discovering your why. Do you think that it was discovering your why that got everybody on board with the idea so fluidly?
I think with the why, for me, I like to think of project-based whys as opposed to like a universal why. Like my universal why is sort of, I just want to be a good person. I want to do good things and I want to hopefully do more good than bad in my existence here on the earth. But to get people on board, I think people just like, they want to be a part of something greater, but everyone's different. So it's about trying to wrap a project in a way that sounds like an opportunity, right? It's about saying, come be a part of this project together, not saying come be a part of my project. It's finding people who have similar values and figuring out how they might benefit from a collaboration together. And so I really see my art as being more collaboration. Like the art of collaboration is more my art than the actual photography, because the photography is almost like a tiny little part of the project. You spend weeks putting something together. So really the magic lies in the production and the visualization and the manifestation of something that was just an idea a couple weeks prior that can then become reality.
I heard you talk about the phases of your project and you just mentioned post-production, and it makes me think of in Ayurveda, we have like when a person's going to go through a cleanse, for example, there's like phases of how it has to work in order to be complete. And I wanted to talk with you about I think you have like 3 phases to your work, like the pre-production.
Yeah, pre-production, production, and post-production.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about how those are different?
Yeah, absolutely. So The pre-production phase is kind of like all that prep work that I was talking about, where you have to get all the pieces of the puzzle together. And you're kind of planning for all the things that can go wrong during that phase and trying to make sure that you assemble all the pieces ahead of time. The production, at least when it comes to photography, since I'm primarily a photographer, it's like the day of the photo shoot, right? So you're there, you're ready to take your picture, and you can only take photos of what is in front of you. And so you have to make sure that that pre-production was done well so that during the shoot, you can do the best job you can. And so then the photography starts to kick in. In my case, that would be directing the model, coming up with new poses, which lens do you use, what angles do you use, what composition do you use, what kind of lighting do you use, right? So all those, like all the things that kind of revolve around the craft of image making. And then the post-production is where you fix all the things that you got wrong. So whatever mistakes you made in pre-production and shoot, you can try to fix in post-production. But it's not really my style, or sometimes like post-production is part of that creative process where people actually like complete their work of art. In my case, there's also the marketing part of the post-production, which is, you've now created the thing. You've created the beautiful art and it's just waiting for the world. But if you just pressed post on Instagram or Facebook, it wouldn't go very far. And so there's this sort of launch strategy that you have to put into something, no different than you might launch a course, for example. You have to put thought and energy, like who's your audience? Who are your champions going to be? Which media outlets are going to republish you? How are you going to get them to talk about you? How do you get that ball rolling? And so on and so forth. So there's a lot of that goes into like a launch also. So yeah, those are my 3 phases of preparation. But really, they all kind of go hand in hand, right? So even in pre-production, you should be thinking about how someone's going to be consuming your final product, right? So the outcome of what you create informs the process that you're going to take in order to create it. And there have been many times where I choose not to do a project because I don't feel like it's going to be worth the time, energy, effort, money, and it's not going to get the resonance that it needs to. So they're kind of actually quite overlapping.
So before you, I guess, like pick up a project, you're like envisioning the outcome and then you're deciding whether or not you think it's worth it?
So I believe, and this is me personally, if you create work that no one is ever going to see, or if I was creating work that nobody was ever going to see, then I probably wouldn't bother creating it. And I think that's because I personally see art as a tool and not like a vocation where I feel compelled to do it regardless of what other people think. I create because I want the art to mean something. I want it to move something, and it can't move something in a vacuum. And so it requires the participation of the audience for it to actually do its work. The goal is not to create a successful piece of art. The goal is to move people with a successful piece of art. And in order to move people, it needs to reach people. And so those inform my creative process. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. I also heard you say, I was watching something that you were being interviewed on, or maybe it was your TED Talk, and you were talking about creating for the sake of creating. You use those words. What does that mean?
I think there are many people who create because they just feel the need to. People draw and paint or dance and move because they need to. They feel compelled to. They would do it if nobody looked at it. And to be fair, there is value in that, right? Like if it brings you joy, if the process of creating something can bring you joy, then yes, please do it. If creating art can help you heal from trauma, then you should create it. Absolutely. There's an outcome that is attached to that creativity. But for me personally, just for creating doesn't actually bring me that much value. Certainly not worth the cost, time, and energy and effort to justify it. And so where I get my inspiration/motivation/creativity from actually comes from what I hope the art can accomplish. And so it's kind of the reason why I have this sort of high impact, low frequency approach to my work. I don't do many projects. I do very few of them, but I try to make each one hit as hard as possible. And in that sort of process, you spend a lot of time trying to find the right nonprofits to work with or the right company to work with to figure out, well, once you have this piece of art, what are you going to do with it? How is it going to spread? What outcomes do you want? And there's a very big difference between like business outcomes and impact outcomes, right? But to be able to ask that question and to interrogate that and to challenge that and to push people one step further than what they're normally comfortable to do, because a capitalist society doesn't really demand much of you. They're generally more concerned about an output. They need a widget, like art as a widget, a thing that they can post onto a thing to get their KPIs that generally have nothing to do with actually like changing the world and making it a better place. So I think as an artist, that's where the work comes, where I really try to push people into that direction.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because a lot of the words that you use impact and yes, you're moving people for sure. And that really is the difference of like if you're just creating art for yourself. I mean, I'm just reflecting on because I'm a writer and I wrote a book. And then the reason I wrote a book is because I was like, I've been writing for like a really long time, but I don't share it with anybody. That seems kind of weird. And then like that kind of shifted my mindset to create a work. And then, I got a publisher and all that. But that sense of moving from doing something because I'm just doing it kind of willy-nilly or just as it comes or whatever to having a sense of purpose to it all of a sudden really changed things for me as well. So I'm happy we're having this conversation. I wanted to ask you about, you were talking about fantasy and that your art often has an element of fantasy to it. And also you were talking earlier about that sort of like habituated mental state that we get into where we're just like kind of almost shut off, like where you were describing you can walk up the street and just let everything pass by, or you could like really see something. I think you've touched on it earlier, but I want to go a little deeper into that importance and the role of fantasy in your work.
It's interesting because I just had a conversation with, it's actually not even released yet. It's going to be this coming Monday, an episode with a video game designer who talks about the value of fiction. And it's almost as if fiction allows you to be somebody else. It allows you to be transported into another world, another situation where your imagination can take place. And suddenly the limitations that apply in your life no longer exist anymore. And with that sort of imaginationary leap comes permission to try something new, to fail, to be different, because it's not failure that directly affects you. And so I think in the work that I do, I guess it's never been a conscious thing because I'd never thought of fiction as a tool, but I think there is something nice when you're able to take a real world situation that is bleak and sad and miserable and give it a different narrative, to attach a narrative of hope, of beauty in a way that's evocative, that sort of breaks past people's instinctive defenses. There's this sort of, I think we have a tendency to look away when things go badly. And that's normal because if you just spent your whole day looking at terrible things, you'd be quite depressed. Actually, I think that's what we do right now with social media and news cycles and so forth. We focus disproportionately on the bad news and it paralyzes us and it makes us miserable. And fantasy and fiction and stories can sort of help us move past those barriers and to help us discover different pieces within us. So this is kind of an answer that I can give in retrospect, sort of during this podcast. I think as a creative person, I just generally love creating cool things, like things that transport people, things that blow your imagination, right? Like, so stylistically, that's what I'm geared towards. But in reflection, I really think that is the value of fantasy and how it can be impactful to people.
And that's one of the things I find so interesting about your mermaid piece and the fact that you've taken something that can be quite uncomfortable to think about and made it extremely beautiful.
Yeah, and it's almost like people want to be sad, but they can't because it's so beautiful. And now that it's beautiful, it's also something worth protecting. But maybe more importantly, it's also something that they can share because it gives them a chance to talk about a problem that they do care about but didn't know how. So it's giving them a language, an ability to talk about something in a way that they didn't have before. And so I think there are layers to this. And I've kind of tried to replicate that over and over again. So I tend to use visual metaphors in the work that I create. So in the project that I did with Dell, where we have basically a model holding up a new laptop surrounded by like 300 laptops or so, they're arranged in sort of a solar farm pattern with the laptops pretending to be solar panels to kind of evoke a metaphor that may be familiar visually. And I think it's something that I, consistently try to do. The body patterns on her body paint are from Tron, which are sort of a nod towards like a digital future that we're heading towards. And so how many metaphors that you can build in. I don't remember the exact definition, but I remember someone telling me that the definition of cool is when something is like a combination of effortlessness and something that's out of your reach, but not too far out of your reach, just like right outside the boundaries of what you know is familiar. So it's the difference between, say, a unicorn versus a horse, or a horse with 8 legs. Like a horse with 8 legs is way too weird. But a unicorn, which is a horse with a horn, or maybe a Pegasus with a horse with wings, is like close enough to reality, right on the edges of our reality, combined with this feeling of effortlessness and beauty and grace that kind of makes something cool. And so that's what I try to kind of bring into the work that I do is, yeah, that intersection of familiarity, but fantasy at the same time.
In writing, it's called magical realism, I think. I'm not sure if it's.
Oh, there's a term for this.
Yeah.
So cool.
It was my favorite thing to write in, like, of all my writing classes. It was like my favorite genre of writing was magical realism. It's not, I wrote a creative nonfiction book. It's a health book about how to prepare your body before you get pregnant. I also write poetry and other things. But when you're a writer and you have that as like, that's my form of art. Magical realism, that's what it's called. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you for that. I love it when you find like words to describe something that you don't quite know how to say. So yeah, thank you for that.
Absolutely. So yes, words are very important.
What's your favorite word?
Oh gosh. Well, I don't know if I have a favorite word. One of the words I think about all the time is weird, because weird feels so weird when I look at it. Like when I'm like, every time I write that word weird, I'm like, yes, it's weird. It just doesn't seem right to me in terms of how it's written. But I love the word poetry. And I love when maybe it's not so much the words themselves, but when the way that they're spoken, and like even studying Ayurvedic medicine, it's an ancient medicine from India, and the medical texts are written in poems, and they're using the same words perhaps that might be used in other medical texts, once you translate them and transliterate them and all that. But then they're also bringing in metaphor of how the body interacts, using like the gardening reference, for example, for fertility, that the woman's uterus is like the soil, and there's the seeds from the man and the woman, and you water them, and that's like your fluids in your body and your love and your hormones and all that stuff. So bringing in that, maybe the metaphor is what I really love.
Nice. Yeah, I think it's the same with me with images. I look for those visual metaphors because I just think it helps people intuit what to say about the image, right? Because it's a dance between the creator and the viewer, right? The viewer is an active participant in that process. And so it almost shows empathy for the viewer when you're able to use effective metaphors.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to get to storm chasing because that was a hilarious thing I saw about you. And
Sure.
yeah, tell me about your storm chasing.
So, Chasing Storms to Raise Awareness for Climate Change is like the first environmental project that I did. And it was actually just driven selfishly. My girlfriend wanted to go storm chasing, and she was just like, Ben, can we go storm chasing? Because she's like, if you stick your mind to something, you tend to end up figuring out a way to do it. But I was like, not motivated, because it was like, well, we can go storm chasing, but like, what would be the point? Like, we could create maybe a beautiful woman in front of a storm, but it felt really pointless. And then she proposed using storms as a metaphor for climate change. And I was like, oh, that's super interesting. And so I found a storm chaser who was willing to take us. I posted online saying we needed extra people, ideally an extra vehicle to come along. And someone said that he had like a refurbished ambulance that he had sort of worked up. And so then we ended up on this like 2-week trip chasing storms and racing ahead of them to put ordinary people in front of these big brewing storms to say that, who are ignoring the coming storm essentially. And the images weren't my best work by far. They're actually really not that amazing from a purely art photography perspective. But it was the first time that I was able to see that the environment needed metaphors to communicate certain issues, and that it was kind of possible to do. And so I think the project was important from my career perspective because it really gave me a direction from which to go forward with from that point forward. Yeah, so I think that's why the project in particular was interesting.
Yeah, and it just seemed like, how can we be so blind? The ignorance is bliss. Or is it that we get so patterned in our routines that we just can't see what's happening, and we create this sort of unintentional resistance
Or yeah, maybe it's just willful blindness, right? Like I think there's a part of it where we're like ostriches sticking in our heads, and maybe there's a good reason for it. Maybe there are other pressing issues in your life that you really need to take care of, and this is not a priority for you right now. And I think that's okay. However, as an artist, I think you just try to use every opportunity to speak your truth and your level of understanding to the world and see where it goes from there. So I think I've learned that the goal is not to make people feel guilty. The goal is just to inform people in a way that opens up the conversation, right? Like, I think success for an artist is introducing people down a rabbit hole and having that subtle change of perspective so that they can continue to do the work and the research from that point forward on their own. It would be impractical to assume that I had to personally oversee the transformation of all these individuals because it would never scale. So yeah.
That was so beautiful. Hey, tell everybody how to get in touch with you because they need to see your work to really understand what we're talking about here and any projects that you have going on. Tell them about your podcast too.
Thank you. So if anyone's interested in my work, I think the best website to go to is unforgettablelabs.com because it has sort of my photos and the videos and the impact all in one place. If you just want to see the art, you can search for Von Wong, that's VONWONG on Google, and it'll be on every single platform. And if you want to hear where these perspectives come from and the conversations that inform my work, so basically where my creativity comes from, I would recommend you check out my podcast. It's called Impact Everywhere, which explores positive impact in unexpected places. And I'm actually going to be taking these conversations onto Clubhouse too. I'm thinking Wednesday, 8 p.m. is the time to do it. So anyone on Clubhouse want to hang out, ask questions, reach out. I am super friendly and I love having meaningful conversations with people. So yeah.
It's been so great talking with you, Benjamin. I'm so glad we were able to connect. And I thank you for being here today on The Wisdom of the Body.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for being here. Here's a quick recap of a few things I learned from Ben. He talked about creating for the sake of creating versus creating for impact. How the reason that you're creating something is a big factor in driving the outcome of the effort. In Benjamin's example, he's creating to move someone to have impact on the world. He talks about how that's really different than creating something for yourself. He actually had this great aha moment working on a project where he was raising money for a young child who needed help. It seemed like he had this really deep emotional connection with the effort and that he was doing it to be in service of this other family who was in need. The energy and the money just really seemed to flow toward this effort. He even said at one point, "This is what creativity should be used for." I don't know about you, but my work, whatever the work I'm doing, always seems to flow better when I'm doing it for someone else. Whether it becomes all about me, when that happens, things just seem to get stuck. Lastly, I can't forget the image of the mermaid swimming in 10,000 plastic bottles. She's the beautiful representation of the challenge we all have on the planet right now from perhaps maybe oversights that were made in the past. I recommend you look at this project online. Ben's website also shows the behind the scenes, and I think it adds so much to the appreciation for the work. I suspect you won't be able to unsee it. And now the question to us is, what can we do to save the mermaid? Thank you for tuning in and dropping in with us today. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. I really want to hear your feedback. To learn more about my work, visit heathergrish.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. And meet me here next time on The Wisdom of the Body.